On May the 16th, 1992, Mexican singer Chalino Sanchez was concluding a performance at the Salon Burgambillas in his hometown of Culiacan. Someone from the audience handed him a note. Sanchez read the note, paused to reflect on its content, steadied himself, and continued with his final performance of the night, a haunting rendition of the song Alma Enamorada, or A Soul in Love. Sanchez left the stage, was bundled into a car, and was shot dead a few hours later. It's believed that what was placed in his hands was a death note, alerting him to his own imminent assassination. Sanchez was a singer of narco corridos, a subgenre of Mexican music focusing on the exploits of drug traffickers in the country. His lyrics were seen as true crime ballads and had won him admiration in Mexico, but also the ire of the country's powerful drug cartels. Yet the voice of the man who would be remembered as the king of the corrido was born not only of the drug violence presence in his home province of Sinaloa, but within the walls of a prison in Tijuana in which he'd served 8 months detention for a string of petty offences. It was in this prison that Sanchez entertained inmates with his ballads and drew inspiration from their stories of crime and loss, which later became the subject of his lyrics. After leaving prison, Sanchez went on to sign his first record deal and reach stardom before his tragic murder at the age of 31. The prison which cultivated Chalino Sanchez stands in Tijuana to this day. Its official title is Cerezo, or the Center for Social Reintegration. However, it's better known as La Mesa State Penitentiary, or even more simply, just La Mesa. La Mesa was constructed in 1956 as a municipal jail for an initial population of 600 inmates. In a curious anecdote, and what would perhaps become a metaphor for what was to come, the first inmate of the prison was none other than a prison guard who managed to accidentally lock himself into one of the newly built cells and went on to spend an hour in confinement inside. As time would tell, prison authorities being themselves captive in the prison would become a relative commonality, if in a less literal sense. Perhaps unusually, La Mesa was built neither on the outskirts of a major city nor hidden in the countryside out of view. Instead, it stands in the very center of the city of Tijuana, in a delegación, or borough, known as La Mesa, from which the prison also inherits its name. It's bordered on one side by a local state courthouse and on another by the Tijuana office of the Chief Judicial Clerk of the state of Baja California. In all other directions, it is surrounded by the residential buildings of the La Mesa district, one of Tijuana's most populous neighborhoods at around 160,000 inhabitants. The prison's location was chosen for largely charitable reasons, to allow low-risk criminals to serve their sentences with their family members close by. Still, its central location and high walls no doubt served as a deterrent to crime in a region grappling to contain the rising power of its drug cartels. The clamor of surrounding city life would certainly not have been lost on those condemned to the prison walls, serving as surplus punishment and a reminder of the route which led to their detention. But as time passed and the prison's population swelled, La Mesa began to take on an unusual character. One which meant that for some of its prisoners, incarceration would hardly amount to punishment matching the severity of their crimes, or even much of any punishment at all. Moreover, a number of colorful characters would pass through the gates of La Mesa in the years following its establishment. Even before Chalino Sanchez entered its gates, a different figure came to call the prison home, one who would be equally revered in Mexican society, albeit for quite different reasons. In 1977, Sister Antonia Brenner moved into La Mesa. The Catholic nun, who became referred to by inmates as La Mama and adherents of a religious order as the Prison Angel, could not have been born to more different circumstances than much of the prison population. Sister Antonia was born Mary Clark to a wealthy Los Angeles family. She grew up in Beverly Hills, was married at age 18, and became mother to no fewer than 7 children. But following a spiritual epiphany, Clark found her way into religious orders at the age of 50 by becoming a nun. Sister Brenner, later Mother Brenner, tended to the inmates of La Mesa and lived for decades in a 10 by 10 foot cell inside the prison. In spite of the gang-dominated surroundings of the prison, Brenner lived a peaceful and austere life in La Mesa. She devoted herself to the needs of the prison's underprivileged, distributing medical supplies and blankets, as well as hygiene products for the 500 inmates of the La Mesa Women's Wing. Sister Brenner prayed with inmates and their families, helped raise bail money for minor thieves, and provided character testimonies for prisoners before court authorities. She gained the admiration of the incarcerated, as well as the wider Mexican public, and it is even said that her influence helped quell an unfolding prison riot in 1994. But with that said, prison riots were not really a commonality in La Mesa. This was largely due to the perverse, gang-enforced order that had begun to spawn behind the prison walls. In the 1980s, the power of Mexico's drug cartels rose dramatically, due in part to the demise of rival cartels in Colombia and the negligence of Mexico's ruling Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI. Not least among the emergent forces was the Tijuana cartel, which had formed that same decade. As the Tijuana cartel's power grew, law and order in Tijuana began to falter. Members who were arrested, often fall guys and low-level sicarios, wound up in a La Mesa prison soon filled not only by thieves and petty criminals, but by high-rolling members of the cartel machine. Some of these were accustomed to a comfortable life outside the prison and saw no reason why this should be any different within it. For many jailed cartel associates, life in La Mesa was honestly pretty great. Have you ever seen Netflix's Narcos? In the fictionalized series focused on Colombia's infamous drug lord Pablo Escobar, an entire episode is dedicated to his brief incarceration inside a custom-built prison in the Colombian mountains, widely referred to as La Catedral. La Mesa could be seen as Mexico's answer to La Catedral. As the prison started to be a hotbed of cartel sicarios, its operation came entirely under their control. Already by 1978, a La Mesa prison director and his deputy had both been assassinated, and prison staff, those that weren't already connected to the cartels, did well to avoid drawing themselves any trouble. This left room for a strange sort of society to emerge within La Mesa, where well-connected inmates would pay to make their stay more palatable. The prison soon featured townhouses within the walls, featuring rooms with cell phones, tiled bathrooms, and even jacuzzis. In 1994, the LA Times published an article in which they followed a young boy around inside the prison, from prayers in the prison chapel to tacos on the Central Plaza, and listening to musicians, in the guise of Chelino Sanchez, regaling gang members and drug users in the prison yards. But Mascara, as the 4-year-old boy was called, was not visiting. His parents were inmates. He lived there. The same article estimated that of the 2,500 known residents of La Mesa at the time, 300 were the wives and children of prisoners. Some were migrants who'd traveled north from Central America but had not succeeded in crossing further north to the US. For many, life in northern Mexico was inhospitable and unforgiving, but a relative haven could be found in the La Mesa prison village. In the absence of a strong authority, over the years, residents made their own rules. They built ramshackle houses in the plaza and equipped themselves with microwaves, DVD players, and air conditioning. Some even had maids, cooks, and bodyguards. There were street food vendors, tequila bars, and a Chinese restaurant. La Mesa was a village within a city and came to be renowned as such. It earned the nickname El Pueblo de la Mesa, translating as La Mesa Village, or even more simply, just El Pueblito. But while the bizarre situation offered a measure of balance, that is not to say that the prison wasn't permanently at risk of spiraling out of control. Jailed cartel leaders operated as they're done on the outside, ordering hits and directing drug trades with impunity. And the plush conditions within the prison were certainly not shared by all. Many inmates languished in squalor, living in tiny, crude cells known as Caracas, while others enjoyed the frills of their cartel connections. Drugs flowed freely into the prison, which could be used to exert control over the drug-dependent members of the community. Also flowing in and out of the prison on a day-to-day basis were the prison's children, who'd leave the Pueblito to go to school before returning to the confines of the prison in the evening. But in spite of unequal circumstances in the prison, many of La Mesa's less fortunate knew better than to complain. Those who controlled the prison were referred to as maiceras, a colloquial expression for a well-fed pig. The maiceras enforced their own order in the prison with a heavy hand and dished out cruel punishment toward troublemakers, the less fortunate and other undesirables. Those who fell foul of the cartels would be thrown into a decrepit and isolated section of the prison known as Las Tumbas, or the Tombs, in which conditions were particularly appalling. Murders were common and were routinely carried out with instruments other than prison shanks or garrote wires. In 1993, around 12 La Mesa inmates were executed, many of them with Uzi miniguns. By now, many of the guards were in the employ of the cartels and bent to their will. A system of bribes and threats warded off dissent, and few were above the risk of retribution for refusal to toe the line. In 1995, a second director of the prison was assassinated, on this occasion by hitmen stationed outside the man's home. Something had to give, and by the early 2000s, state authorities had had enough. In the year 2000, A landmark general election broke the power of the long-dominant institutional Revolutionary Party in Mexico. The same election saw a non-PRI president elected for the first time in 71 years. And unlike the cartel-friendly policies of the PRI, which suspiciously had received its single highest body of votes in the drug-ravaged state of Sinaloa, Vicente Fox's right-wing National Action Party had the power of the gangs in its sights. In 2002, a shake-up was in store for La Mesa, one which would lead to a new order in the prison, but also lead to vicious bloodshed. On August the 20th, around 1,500 Mexican federal police and army servicemen carried out a surprise nighttime raid on the prison and began transferring its most dangerous inmates to a different facility near the border town of Tecate. Soon after, authorities began dismantling around 900 structures inside the prison, amongst them its many improvised shacks and stores, and also clamped down hard on drug trading between inmates. And with this, the authorities, for the first time in decades, were able to gain an accurate measure of what exactly had become of the prison. It was determined that the prison, built for an initial 600 inmates and built with an absolute capacity of 2,000, now had close to 7,000 residents. It was also found that the price of many hard drugs was actually lower in the prison than it was on the street, and that arms and prostitutes were available on demand for detainees. Aside from the hundreds of crude pieces of improvised infrastructure, authorities estimated that the Pueblito was home to around 150 businesses, from bars and food stores to La Mesa's aforementioned Chinese restaurant, which had taken shape after a boat of illegal Chinese immigrants docked in the city of Ensenada, and its crew were promptly flung in prison for smuggling. The prison authorities uncovered a football pitch, basketball and volleyball courts, several dry cleaning services, a domestic appliances warehouse, a loan shark service, and even a small sewing factory. Doctors and lawyers advertised their services openly as if it were a shopping center. Cell phones were so common as to be sold commercially to inmates. It was even said the Mexican world boxing champion Julio Cesar Chavez had once shown up and fought an exhibition bout in the prison. But all of that came to an abrupt end as the state wrestled back control of La Mesa. Families were shepherded out, including children, some with their toys in their hands, who'd known little other than the confines of the prison their entire lives. Enterprises, amenities, and La Mesa's Caracas cells were closed and torn down. And in their absence, a more conventional law and order in the prison took form. But the changes were not welcomed by many of the residents, not least the powerful cartels. With their authority re-established, officials sought to maintain a system of disciplined order inside the prison. But in 2008, brutal violence would descend upon La Mesa. On the 13th of September, a riot began after a prisoner was killed by guards during a routine search for drugs and contraband. The riot raged for 12 hours, during which a further 3 inmates were killed before they were put down. But worse was to follow. As the prison authorities struggled to contain the simmering tension over the riot, complaints of a lack of water soon turned into another mass uprising. On September the 16th, the prisoners overwhelmed the prison authorities, forcing them to withdraw outside the La Mesa compound. The army put the prison under siege as rampaging inmates swarmed inside the walls and onto the roof, showering rocks and debris upon security forces outside. Frantic family members amassed outside, pleading for a peaceful resolution to the unrest. But their pleas fell on deaf ears. Mexican police and state troops stormed the facility and wrestled back control from the rioters once more. At least 19 prisoners were killed in the unrest, and around 43 were injured during the melee. A further 250 inmates were transferred to other prisons in the cities of Tecate and Ensenada. Half of the compound was burned to the ground, and columns of black smoke billowed up into the sky as the prison withered under the weight of open warfare. But once security forces had completed their recapture of the facility, order was finally restored. An even more restrictive system of authority was introduced, and this time it was here to stay. Today, La Mesa has taken on the guise of a standard, if not crowded, North American prison. Inmates are subject to a strict system of oversight, being allowed out of their cells only for a few precious hours each week for yard time and monitored visits from family members. Interactions are strictly controlled to prevent assembly and gang violence, and prisoners are released from their cells only through a painstaking and laborious process, one at a time. The prison population is strictly segregated according to the degree of severity of the crimes committed, with the most violent and risky prisoners occupying a cell block under the most restrictive conditions of all. The new realities of La Mesa are hardly lost on those confined to them. In the mid-2000s, a US television crew visited the prison, where they met Francisco Javier Villa Padilla, a notorious cartel hitman residing in one of the prison's isolated wards. Padilla reflected bitterly on the life he gave up through his imprisonment, sacrificing money, connections, his family, his wife, and his girlfriends, who were different people. Today, the prison houses over 3,000 inmates, still significantly more than its intended capacity of 2,000, but far less than the 7,000-strong village that once stood on the site. Inmates are confined to cramped spaces, sometimes several to a cell, under strict and unforgiving conditions. The reality is a far cry from the Pueblito of the 1970s to the 1990s, with long-term prisoners no doubt reflecting nostalgically on the communal dances, musical performances, and club nights, once a routine feature of incarceration there. Gone are the ballads of Chelino Sanchez, which once echoed through the walls. No longer do the soothing overtones of Mother Antonia Brenner, who died in 2013, offer respite to the prison's forlorn. No more do children run through its corridors, and no longer are residents and visitors free to roam the corridors and Caracas as they'd once done. What is left is silence and solitude. A Spartan prison, broken only by the continuing clamour of the surrounding city, where time doesn't stand still, as it does within the prison walls. Thank you for watching.